Joining us now is Ruy Teixeira. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Hi, Ruy. How are you?
I'm good.
Thanks for joining us. So you have
Sure.
a new piece that you wrote a couple of days ago for Think Progress called Raising the Minimum Wage as a Political Gold Mine, where you
hmm
basically explained why raising the minimum wage is not only the right thing to do sort of morally, it's also kind of a political killer app. It's hugely popular with Democrats and independents, and it even splits the Republican coalition. So could you tell us about that?
Right. Well, one of the most longstanding features of public opinion, and maybe not widely appreciated, is just how popular raising the minimum wage is. And recently they have been asking questions about raising it to $9, which is sort of on the table, and we get this overwhelmingly positive response from the public as a whole. As you mentioned, Democrats and Republicans are really enthusiastic. People with lower incomes are extremely enthusiastic, but so are people with higher incomes. And if we look, actually, even people who say they affiliate with the Republican Party, we find that they're split roughly down the middle between those who support raising the minimum wage and those who do not. And then even more interesting, if we look at white working class Republicans, who are really the mainstay of the Republican Party these days, are white non-college voters. These relatively downscale members of the Republican coalition are pretty strong in their support for raising the minimum wage, whereas the more affluent, educated part of the Republican coalition is opposed to it. So, you don't have to be a political strategist on the scale of Karl Rove or David Plouffe to see that is, a pretty good wedge for the Democrats in terms vis-a-vis the Republican Party.
Absolutely. So I guess to sort of bring it into the present political context, there's sort of two related questions that occur for me, and I guess one is, so President Obama did advocate raising the minimum wage at his last State of the Union. He came out for it pretty strongly, had some very eloquent words, and it doesn't seem like the administration's chosen to kind of take that idea on the road. And I'm just wondering, given the kind of obvious assessment that you just gave, why would that be the case? Why aren't we hearing about this constantly?
I don't have a good explanation for that in a strict political calculus sense. You'd think it would make enough sense that even if it wasn't President Obama's number one favorite issue, that he would still push it because its political dividends are so obvious. It fits right into the Democratic agenda, as we've been discussing. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't have a budgetary implication, which is the big hang-up of a lot of the other things he wants to do. So, one might speculate that moves like this are viewed, at least in some quarters, as being anti-business, and maybe there's some hesitancy there to court that kind of feedback, that kind of blowback from the business sector. But, I certainly think that it's worth the trouble for them to try to do that. When you look at the underlying data, and you look, as I discussed in the article, about how well this even plays in redder states and more conservative parts of the country.
Absolutely.
People just like it. So why would you not push this?
Yeah, it seems really commonsensical. Moving to that redder part of the country, the sort of Republican coalition, it seems to me that an incredible amount of energy has been put, especially in the last couple of years, of kind of bridging that gap that maybe still does exist and is kind of demonstrated through this issue in the Republican coalition, of trying to basically say that to Republican voters that social and economic conservatism are kind of part and parcel of the same kind of moral outlook or package, so to speak. Like you see maybe candidates a couple of decades ago who might not have been, they might have been more kind of solely focused on social issues, kind of bridging extreme economic and extreme social conservatism together, someone like Michelle Bachmann, as kind of part of the same fundamentalist worldview. And I'm just wondering, it seems really striking that in spite of all of that effort and all of that work, the minimum wage is still really popular for the same kind of basic, obvious reasons that you're articulating, which is that people who don't make as much money understand the need to make more money. It's not that complicated, but there's obviously an effort to kind of reverse that thinking, and it doesn't seem to be working.
No, I don't think so. Certainly not in terms of this issue. And you would think that given that, and given the vulnerability Republicans obviously have in this score, that Democrats would just unleash all the furies they can unleash to try to put that issue in play and really push it. I mean, the Republicans are in some danger of imprinting themselves even worse than they have as the party that simply cares about the well-being of the most affluent and couldn't care less about the fate of most Americans who have to have a job. They've struggled. They try to get by. They're just not into it. Look at all the things Romney said in his last campaign. Look at all the things many other Republicans have said before and since. Look at their, so if you put them in the crosshairs of the minimum wage, that just should worsen their already existing problem. And again, it's a little baffling why all Democrats aren't just sort of pitching in 24/7 to do just that.
Absolutely, and we'll get to that more in just a second. I actually just sort of parenthetically, I'd love for you to give a kind of a brief answer on this, because I know that as soon as we have this conversation, this show actually has a sort of small loyal band of libertarian listeners, and Sam regularly puts out a challenge to them and one to sort of come in and debate and call in and debate. And I know some libertarians are just obsessed with this notion that raising the minimum wage would hurt downscale workers and harm the economy. And I'm just wondering if you can give the kind of, the brief debunk of that talking point.
Well, the brief debunk is that, there have been many, many studies done on the minimum wage, and certainly the data are not conclusive that it's any kind of a job killer. And by and large, the employment effects, such as they are, tend to be pretty minimal. I mean, this has been studied in many different ways at many different times, including sort of natural experiments adjoining states that do and do not raise the minimum wage, what are the effect on jobs, and so on. And it just doesn't appear to happen. What happens is if you raise the wage floors, a few businesses will go out of business and weren't very efficient, but, the economy goes on. The economy adjusts. People learn how to use labor that's a little bit is paid a little bit more. Maybe because they do that, they get a little bit higher quality labor. There's so-called efficiency wages and so on. And there's a lot of reasons why just raising the minimum wage wouldn't result in catastrophic employment. And in fact, just keep on raising the minimum wage at reasonable pace, and the labor market doesn't seem to have much of a problem to adjust to that. And just to underscore that in terms of pure economics, there is a regular poll of economists that's done that asked them about policy issues like the minimum wage. In the most recent time they did this poll of economists, those economists actually supported raising the minimum wage, the majority of them, to $9 an hour, and then indexing it to inflation, right? So it keeps on rising.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
These are labor market economists. These are people who study this kind of stuff. And they pretty strongly endorse the idea that the minimum wage, in essence at this point in the United States, is too low. And we can afford to make it higher, and we can afford to keep raising it so it keeps pace with inflation. So the idea that there's this cut-and-dried economic case that, if you raise the minimum wage, there are catastrophic employment effects is just baloney. It's just, we don't see it in the data. I mean, we see it in the theory of a certain kind of libertarian, pure free market economics. We see it in the theory. We don't see it in the real world.
Right. Well, as so often with libertarian arguments, it kind of goes back to that the old joke about the economist and the engineer and the other guy stranded on an island, and they need a can opener to open the only.
Let's assume we have a can opener.
Yeah. Imagine we have a
catastrophic employment effect.
Right.
Now that we.
Right. Yeah, no, so that makes perfect sense. Now, I want to shift gears, getting back into what you were getting to before, which is why aren't the Democrats hitting this issue 24/7? And I think we should mention that you are the co-author of a really, really smart book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, which came out in 2002. And if it came out in 2007, 2006 or 2005, it would have been like but you had a couple of years where, because of 2002 congressional elections and 2004 re-election of George W. Bush, there was a kind of like look at those liberal suckers, picturing an emerging Democratic majority.
Right.
But
too right, too early. But what are you going to
do? but what you really did in that book is you mapped out, really in many respects, what the Obama coalition, what the kind of current Democratic coalition is, which is a sort of growth of through a rising Hispanic population, obviously also, and other immigrant populations, African Americans, educated and kind of mobile workers across ethnic and economic backgrounds, who have a more kind of socially liberal outlook and are more open in some ways to the role of government. And that's really emerged. And I think, though, that what we're kind of seeing now as a kind of fault line in that coalition is that even as there's a real consolidation under Obama of the Democrats being the party of social progress, of marriage equality, of rights for women, and as the Republicans just get more and more crazy and intransigent and reactionary, that fault line is becoming really clear. But you make the point, have made the point recently, that there is still a significant portion of white working class voters that the Democrats need to speak to politically, and also, one would argue morally, like people who are experiencing really intense economic stagnation, and there isn't really a kind of policy agenda to meet that crisis, or the urban American economic crisis, for that matter. And I'm just wondering, do you think that is that the fault line in that coalition now, between the social and economic issues, and what explains that fault line?
Well, I think the key to the coalition's health moving forward is definitely in the realm of economics, because if you can't produce fairly strong growth that's fairly equally distributed, I think it's difficult not only to consolidate the coalition that you do have, the various rising demographics that have powered Obama to victory in the last couple of presidential elections. You run the risk that you won't always be running the margins you are today with these groups, because if you can't deliver for them, if you can't deliver opportunity in a growing economy, just because they like you now doesn't mean they'll always like you. And then beyond that, it's the kind of the problem you were mentioning, that they need a certain, reasonable minority level of support among white working class voters, and they're much less likely to get it if the economy isn't doing well and people aren't doing well within that economy, and that especially applies to these kinds of voters who are congenitally somewhat suspicious of the Democrats in government, not inclined to give it a break, and but they'll feel much better about it if things are going well for them and their families, which is very difficult to do unless, again, the economy's doing relatively well and they're doing well within that economy. So that's why issues like the minimum wage can really be an important part of building that, keeping the coalition together and widening it by including more white working class voters. And conversely, if you're not able to do it, I think you're always vulnerable to blowback from the other side. You're always vulnerable to a white working class revolt against the party. You're vulnerable to attrition and support among sort of your core constituencies. Everything becomes much easier if you build an economy that delivers for most people. And I think, in Obama's defense, he has made those, sort of sounded those notes much more lately than he has in the past. He seems to be finally off his kick about, oh my God, we got to deal with the deficit, the national debt, we got to be fiscally responsible. Maybe too little, too late, or it'd be nice if it had at least started earlier. And of course, dealing with the Republican House is nobody's idea of a good time. But nevertheless, I think at least he's talking about the right things now. And I think if he and his party consistently push these kinds of issues, and just make no bones about it and aren't afraid to strike a populist note every now and then, I think they'll benefit politically, and the country will benefit in terms of better policy. But first things first, you got to start by saying the right things and pushing the right issues, and then you see if you can make it pay off politically, which in turn leads to greater political strength and the ability to make more good things happen. And hopefully they're on the right road now, and they're going to keep pushing it. But But we'll see. We've seen this kind of vacillation back and forth. We've seen the populist Obama followed by the fiscally responsible Obama. It's just he hasn't really had a consistent message over the course of his presidency. I think that's fair to say.
Right.
But maybe he's going to be consistent now, and that would be good.
Yeah. How much would you say? We saw with movements like Occupy help bring income inequality to the forefront of just discussion, and we have now the growing fast food forward movement, where we're about to see this week another fast food action to raise the minimum wage for fast food workers, and this is a growing movement. How much would you say that has been effective in growing the national opinion on being for higher minimum wage?
Well, I think it certainly helps buttress the issue. I think that Occupy was very successful at raising the overall issue of how much inequality there is, how bad the trends have been, and how it doesn't really have to be that way and shouldn't be that way. I think they were less successful in sustaining themselves as a movement, but that's another discussion. But I certainly think they helped change the conversation, and they did. It did result, I think, in national political forces in and around the Democratic Party being much more attentive to these issues and being willing to talk about them more. Now, that said, it's not the case that there's been a full-fledged crusade on the part of the Democratic Party and Obama to raise the minimum wage. I think, as was alluded to earlier, it's been mentioned, but it's been a little bit of an ancillary issue. And I think if Occupy and these other protests had been, as successful as they would have liked to have been, we would see these national political forces being more strident in terms of how they push this issue. But I think progress is being made, but it'll take a while.
Actually, Ruy, to just follow up on that point you're making about Occupy Wall Street, this isn't, this maybe brings another kind of lens into this conversation. But I was actually, I was talking about this, I was on some Huffington Post live panel last week, and we were talking about the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, and this kind of point about Occupy Wall Street sort of fizzling out was made, and I pushed back in some respects because I think, as you're saying, I think that and as Matt's saying, that the kind of rhetorical shift, at least, that President Obama has embraced is very connected to Occupy Wall Street and kind of what's been happening in terms of that type of movement. But it also just seems to me that one of the reasons that the Tea Party obviously has been a more sustainable force than Occupy Wall Street is even if you take the most charitable view of the Tea Party movement, that it's not just a pure kind of AstroTurf corporate, funded movement, and there is a kind of genuine kind of right-wing populist tinge to it. Nonetheless, the practical policy effects, whether it's genuine or not genuine, corporate America couldn't be more happy with. Great, don't regulate Wall Street, get rid of environmental regulations. That sounds great to us. With Occupy Wall Street, you're really, you're advocating on behalf of people who just don't have power in Washington because, fundamentally they don't have campaign money, it seems to me. And is this another case where that kind of like old chestnut of you need genuine campaign finance reform in some respects, or we can't really get to the root of these issues? Is there some truth in that, or no?
Well, I certainly would support serious campaign finance reform. I think a lot of people would at this point, and it certainly would help. But I don't know if I would let Occupy off the hook quite that easily. I think they were in a somewhat more difficult position than the Tea Party because they're not advocating on the behalf of deep-pocketed people, and they're not going to get resources from those people. On the other hand, I think that they, by their singular failure to embrace any kind of real agenda, any kind of real organizing strategy, and any kind of relationship with the, sort of traditional center-left electoral politics, what have you, they pretty much shot themselves in the foot, and it was almost guaranteed that the influence of the movement would decay quite rapidly because they simply couldn't sustain a presence, and they simply didn't have anything for people to do that was very concrete other than camping out, and that ran its course. So I know they're still out there. I know they're still doing things, but let's face it, as a movement, it's just really off the radar screen, and I don't think it affects people's thinking much these days.
Yeah. The final question on the minimum wage. Do you think that is there a more aggressive push on the state level where Democrats are in control on a state level, and are we going to start to see this happen state by state through pushing it through legislatures and ballot initiatives?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I think that there is some of that out there already, and I think it's the case that, given some of the gridlock we see in the nation's capital and difficulty addressing important problems like this one, that it makes sense to do it in the states, and we have increasingly robust state-level coalitions, sort of progressive coalitions, as it were, that work in and around a variety of issues, and I think they may be taking up this one and pushing it, and I think that would be all to the good. I think when you got to use whatever avenue you can to advance this particular idea, and as we were discussing at the top of the conversation, this stuff is just damn popular, so right. Why not?
Why not, indeed. Ruy Teixeira, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody go read his piece, Raising the Minimum Wage is a Political Goldmine at Think Progress.